Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. It's a busy week, a lot of news, a lot of things happening. We're also very grateful to have our guests today. Before I kick off, I'd like to welcome everyone and say, it's the 16th of July, tomorrow being the 17th, the lifting of border restrictions, with the exception of Victoria and Greater Sydney at this point. So there's a couple of topics floating around that you have registered in. One is around borders. The second one is around JobKeeper. And then keeping is something on the minds of all Territorians, especially in tourism, the seasonal nature and our mix of international versus domestic travellers traditionally as part of our business. There's been an announcement this week for $233 million in Parks Australia, the lion's share of that for Kakadu National Park and Uluru-Kata Tjuta National Park. We understand today that the federal government will be announcing a job trainer program, so we're interested to hear if there's any details that might pertain to tourism in that, and also any updates on aviation. I think that's probably some of the key topics that have come through the questions, and we'll be deferring to our panel after we hear from our guest speakers today to raise any questions. I'd like to take the opportunity just to remind everyone that these meetings work really well because we operate them under a Chatham House rule arrangement. Thank you, Mike. The gathering happens under Chatham House rule, being participants are free to use the information received, but neither, importantly, the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers, nor that of any other participant may be revealed. This is to encourage openness and free sharing of information. And we say that because for any of our media friends who do show their great interest in tourism and do join us, we ask that as we have on every one of these live Q&As that you respect that this is an opportunity for the tourism industry to hear from our leaders, from to give us some insights as to what's happening. And we can't do this without a free flow, open share of information, hence why we have a Chatham House rule on the meeting. Today's guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged and really grateful to have the Honourable Simon Birmingham, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Simon Birmingham has served as a Liberal Party Senator for South Australia since May 2007, and in August 2018 he was appointed as the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, as well as the Deputy Leader of the Government in the Senate. So I think along with the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Health Minister, he'd be one of Australia's busiest ministers going at the moment. And we're really grateful that he's been able to get that time aside for us today. Thank you. Also, we have on the line as a guest, who is a return guest, Simon Westaway, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Tourism Industry Council. For those of you who are familiar with Simon, and also Australian Tourism Industry Council is the National Representative for Tourism. ATIC represents thousands of local tourism enterprises nationally. A feature of over the industry is 90% of registered tourism businesses, be they small to medium enterprises, sole traders to large corporations employing collectively over 1 million people. And of course, we have our live Q&A regular panellists today. I'd like to welcome back, of course, and thank you for your regular appearance with the industry, the Honourable Lauren Moss, Minister for Tourism, Sport and Culture. Online, I can also see Andrew Hopper, CEO of Department of Tourism, Sport and Culture. Thank you, Andrew. And we have Chair of Tourism Top End, Michael Scott, and Patrick Bedford joining us from Alice Springs, Chair of Tourism Central Australia. My counterpart, Daniel, CEO of Tourism Central Australia. G'day, mate. And we have one apology who said he would love to be here, but he couldn't make it this morning, and that's, of course, Michael Bridge, Chair of Tourism NT. So I'd start with an acknowledgement. Thanks to all the members from across the Territory for joining us this morning. Be you a member of Tourism Top End, Tourism Central Australia, or somebody of one of our affiliated associations, thank you very much. So at this point, I'd like to open with a quick Territory update because there is quite a bit happening, and I'd like to welcome the Honourable Lauren Moss, Minister for Tourism, Sport and Culture.
Thank you, Glenn. And I'd also like to acknowledge Minister Birmingham on the line today. It's absolutely fantastic to have you, and Simon Westaway, who's been a regular contributor, Mike, Rachel, Glenn, Patrick, Daniel, and all your members. It's always a privilege to be able to join on these regular webinars, and I think we all find them really, really useful. So thank you again for bringing people together so regularly. There is a lot happening this week. I know you're all very, very aware of the borders opening tomorrow on the 17th of July and the recent announcements that have been made in relation to hotspots in Victoria and also Greater Metropolitan Sydney. We do have those measures in place to be able to quickly put in place hard borders around hotspots, and we're obviously continuing to be regularly briefed by the CHO and others to make sure that we're making the quick decisions that we need to make around the borders and around hotspots wherever they might appear across the country. But I acknowledge as well that with Greater Metropolitan Sydney and Victoria that that's also been a bit of a blow to some of you as well as we look towards welcoming domestic visitors back into your businesses across the territory. But we'll continue to work with you and do what we can to support you through this time and make sure that we're continuing to put out the information for you so you know what is happening. Obviously, if anybody does come from a hotspot from Victoria or Sydney or have been in those locations over the last 2 weeks, they will need to go into directed mandatory supervised quarantine and will be charged for that accommodation as well. So we continue to make sure we're putting the health of Territorians first, but obviously over the last few weeks, we've also been doing things like the Territory Tourism Vouchers, which I've been hearing very positive things about across the Territory. And just on that note, I want to thank the Visitor Information Centres, because I know you've been absolutely under the pump, making sure that you're answering those questions and making those bookings, and the phones have been running hot. And I think your teams have done an absolutely incredible job. So please pass on my thanks to them for that. It's really fantastic to see people getting out and about and demonstrating their commitment to local Territory businesses. We're going to continue to look at what we need to do to support you through this time. I recently did the trip up from Alice Springs back up to Darwin and met a number of operators along the way. And unsurprisingly, the feedback to me continued to be wanting clarity around JobKeeper and what happens post-September with JobKeeper and that recognition of our reverse seasonality. And I know I have spoken in this forum before. I've had many conversations with other counterparts and with certainly with Minister Birmingham around our reverse seasonality. And I know that he understands that issue that we do face here in the Territory. And also wanted to take this opportunity to welcome recent announcements around increased investment in Kakadu and Uluru-Kata-Tjuta National Park. That's something that we also continue to advocate really heavily around. We want to make sure that we're seeing that work happening as quickly as possible, and we use this opportunity to invest in the wonderful assets that we have and our really strong point of difference, which is our incredible environment and our beautiful parks, amongst other things. So thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this morning, and I'll stay on the line and look forward to continuing to listen. And please feel free to get in touch with my office as you have been doing if you've got any questions or if there's anything that we can continue to assist you with.
Thank you, Minister Moss. Thank you again. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Senator Honourable Simon Birmingham, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Good morning from sunny Adelaide, it looks like, if that's light coming in your window there, sir.
Well, good morning, Glenn, and thanks so much for the chance to join everyone, and particularly good to be on the hookup with Lauren, who's a wonderful advocate for Territory and Territory tourism. And yes, it is blue skies and sunshine in Adelaide today, so that's nice. Although I don't know how much of it I'm going to get outside to enjoy, sadly. Look, can I thank you for the chance to talk to Territory industry at present? And first and foremost, I want to start with a big thank you to everybody. The sacrifices that people and businesses across Australia, but especially businesses in the tourism and hospitality type sectors have made have been incredible. And those sacrifices have come, I know, at enormous cost to individuals, businesses, families, and communities generally. But those sacrifices have not been for nothing. They have allowed Australia to weather the storm of COVID-19 far better than the rest of the world. Notwithstanding the problems we're seeing happening in Victoria at present, we have still escaped the scenes of overflowing hospitals that crippled parts of Europe, the mass graves and refrigerated truck morgues that continue to be the case in parts of the United States. And so it's important just to keep a bit of a sense of perspective right now of how bad things have been in some parts of the world, and yet how effective the sacrifices so many people have made in Australia have been to ensure that we have managed to not have those horror scenes and to keep COVID under control in Australia. But in recognising those sacrifices, I know just how important it's been for us to try to deliver effective support on the ground. And I want to thank people for the feedback that's been there around particularly JobKeeper and business payments and some of those other measures that we've put through as a government to try to help underpin businesses through these tough times. Other measures that have been to try to get banks to behave a little better around repayment issues, landlords to deal with rental issues and those factors, which I know have worked better in some places than others, in some instances than others, but it's all been about trying to ensure that businesses can see themselves through what are incredibly tough times. I know there are tough times right around the world. The global estimates are that travel will be down by some 60 to 80% this year. I suspect it'll be at the higher end of that range. And in Australia, the early estimates are that tourism-related expenditure could be down by some 40%. What I'm seeing, though, is that there is, and this is the great hope, obviously, as certain borders reopen, there is great enthusiasm from Australians to get back out and see the rest of the country when they're allowed to and when they feel it's safe to do so. Like the Territory, we're at the back end of school holidays now in South Australia. And when I talk to the tourism operators here, Kangaroo Island and Flinders Ranges on the West Coast, they have seen during these school holidays a real step up and in fact much far busier than usual for school holidays in terms of people getting out and travelling across the state. And that's a positive sign for what we can try to achieve if we look to the next 6, 9, 12 months, however long it is that we continue sadly to have to rely on international travel restrictions to keep Australia safe, but that there is a natural enthusiasm of Australians to get out there and particularly to travel further distances and into regional areas, and that bodes well for the potential of the Territory to be able to capitalise on that as you reopen. And I hope that we can see circumstances contained in Sydney sufficiently that perhaps we can all make the decisions to reopen to New South Wales as well and really capture that big market. I know there's an understandable caution from your government as well as the state government here in SA about what's happening in Sydney right now, but equally there is every reason to believe that if we can keep current problems quarantined to Victoria and get on top of what is a much smaller problem in New South Wales, then hopefully in the weeks to come we can all take another look at the Sydney situation and really open up to that sort of market. I understand there's lots of interest around what will happen with the JobKeeper payments going forward in particular and with other support measures. I can't give tourism operators across the Territory the exclusive drop of exactly where decisions will probably land, but I want to assure you we are very close to finalising those decisions. So JobKeeper is currently in place through until 28th of September, and we will make final decisions and announcements publicly around what support looks like post the 28th of September this month in July, so that everyone's got certainty there. We obviously stood JobKeeper up at very short notice, and what we're trying to do now is give people a decent period of notice, following on from the consultations we've been taking about what sort of support is necessary for the future. Something I can say is to reassure all of you as tourism operators that we saw restrictions in relation to tourism and travel as the very first decisions that were taken to protect the country from COVID. And sadly, there'll probably be the very last restrictions that are taken off when we emerge from this crisis. So what people can have confidence in there is we know the tourism, travel and hospitality sectors are special cases in this, and we are very mindful of that as we deal with the changes to JobKeeper. I'm very mindful, as Lauren referenced and as you referenced too, Glenn, to the different seasonal nature of the territory as well. And so that weighs on our thinking as well in terms of looking at how JobKeeper applies into the future. It also weighs on my thinking as we look at how do we incentivise Australians to get out there and travel too. It's absolutely our intention that when we have a critical mass of state borders open again, we really do want to put a real impetus back behind the Holiday Here This Year campaign and message that we initiated after the bushfires. We want to leverage that enthusiasm of Australians to get out there and make sure they go that extra mile, travel to parts of the country that are more reliant traditionally on international visitors, as parts of the top end are. Make sure that they travel and see things in ways they wouldn't usually. And that does mean also just looking at some of those counter-cyclical activities. As I said before, we're seeing in SA great feedback from tourism operators who would usually in the July school holidays see South Australians want to head to warmer weather somewhere else, often up the Territory or Queensland. That hasn't been possible. South Australians have happily, though, got out and embraced different activities in a different climate at this time. And the test is for us all to also be thinking on the positive side, if we've got those borders open, even going into the wet, how do we actually make sure that we generate activity and experiences that bring people in, knowing they're going to see the Territory in a different way, but equally to actually get that sort of movement happening in the future. Obviously, we're also looking at how we can both stimulate the economy in some of the ways and also provide a better basis for the long term. And that's what the announcement that was made the other day in relation to investment in the Commonwealth National Parks was all about. How do we provide some immediate stimulus through investment in upgraded campgrounds, cultural centres, walking tracks, viewing platforms, all those sorts of things across Kakadu and Uluru. And in doing so, not only stimulate that local economic activity, but also ensure that you've got an even better product to come out of the other end. So around 162 million of the 233 million that was announced for Commonwealth National Parks will be spent in the Territory. So the vast majority of it is Territory focused, and of course is being worked through in conjunction with park management, traditional owners and others to ensure we get the maximum economic hit on the ground. I'm sure it's probably going to be more useful to take questions, but I guess in wrapping up, I want to assure you all that we are doing a lot of work for the ultimate international recovery phase as well. We can't predict exactly when that will happen. I don't know exactly when a New Zealand bubble might be possible. I am hopeful that we can see some breakthroughs there with New Zealand at some stage soon. Obviously, the situation in Victoria and the concern about Sydney has kind of impeded that to a degree. But I'd love nothing more than to see at least the parts of the country in Australia that are open to one another also be able to be open to Kiwis to be able to come and visit. And if we can get that type of model working safely with a near neighbour like New Zealand, and then it might provide some opportunity for us to look at other targeted, careful, cautious steps in relation to other types of visitation into the future. But we also know there's a lot of work to be done to support the aviation sector in its return when we see restrictions lifted, particularly to get international flights back when we can. and to ensure that Australia capitalises on our overall safe and effective management of COVID, particularly in some of those traditional Western markets, parts of Europe and the US and elsewhere, and really trying to make sure that we get some of those long-stay premium visitors back, and doing so knowing that our country's proven itself as one of safety and reliability. Look, I'll stop there. Look forward to the rest of our engagement and to take a few questions and comments along the way, Glenn. So thanks very much once again.
Thank you, Mr. Birmingham, for your opening remarks. I'll take the opportunity because I know that Chair of Tourism Central Australia, Patrick Bedford's been doing quite a bit of consultation this week in readiness, and I know that Patrick has some questions from Central Australia for you, sir. Patrick?
Good morning, Minister Birmingham. How are you? Good to have you on board. I really appreciate it. I'm probably going to touch on some of the stuff you just spoke about, obviously. The biggest one is obviously the JobKeeper. I think that's the elephant in the room, and from a tourism operator point of view, but also tourism industry, we're really kind of apprehensive of what's going to happen in September. I think it's paramount that this JobKeeper is extended or brought back in a similar form for tourism. As you can imagine, and Lauren Moss, obviously, Minister Moss has touched on the fact of seasonality here. We're coming into September, which is coming into our normal off season. So there's no chance of us getting some revenue through the doors up here in the NT to keep business moving forward. So it is definitely paramount. But on top of that, I think as well, I think we're going to have a workforce that's kind of sitting there idle. It's not just the JobKeeper, but it's upskilling that workforce to kind of bring them to 2020 when tourism starts to come back, which will probably be around for the domestic market in April, March, April for us, which is normally when we start to kind of see our peak season. Is there much in the pipeline around upskilling from the territory kind of point of view from a funding aspect on top of whatever the new JobKeeper or the extension of the JobKeeper looks like?
Thanks, Patrick. So in terms of JobKeeper, I guess some of the issues that we're grappling with is if it's to extend, how do we make sure that it is better targeted to those who really need it? And there are definitely cases where we know that businesses, unlike those in the tourism sector who do genuinely need it, that others have manipulated their turnover or their incomes to ensure their eligibility. There's probably a few too many barristers around Australia who've been claiming JobKeeper, if I'm to give a blunt example. So we've been looking carefully at if you do extend or do something of a similar nature, how do you tighten eligibility so that those who are have been suffering a prolonged downturn in their revenue relative to where they otherwise would have been and are likely to continue to do so, they're the ones that we know we need support and whose businesses we still want to ensure survive to the other side. It's about, yes, it's about supporting employees, but crucially, it's also about ensuring we have that business survival. Then it's also looking at some of the wage elements there. And we do, from parts of the economy now, get some feedback that it's actually hard to get some people back to work. That in some cases, JobKeeper payments mean that people are relatively comfortable in what they're receiving as an individual, and if they're asked to come in and do a shift, they're not actually getting paid anymore as a result of that. So working through just some of those bits of feedback that, as I said, JobKeeper was initially designed in a hurry to meet an urgent and immediate need. We've had a bit of time now to be able to really just get some proper feedback, and that's why we're trying to get the balance right in giving everybody essentially 2 months' notice of what the future is going to look like, but also give ourselves enough time to see if we can iron out some of the wrinkles in it. Make sure that we genuinely, if we're taking anything forward, are targeting it where it's necessary, and also not removing the need for some businesses to have to make structural adjustments. I mean, tragic though it was to see Qantas, for example, the other week make its decision around downsizing their workforce, it's also necessary. The demand for travel, particularly international travel, isn't coming back quickly in 6 or 12 months' time. And so we acknowledge that it was right for them to make that sort of long-term support there. In terms of other types of support, especially around training and so on, a skills package that was announced today essentially has two significant elements to it. One is a further extension. You can read into this as you wish in terms of analogies with JobKeeper, but a further extension of some of the wage subsidy support we've been giving for apprentices, so that existing apprentices employed in businesses, we extend that wage subsidy, I think it's right through till March, to give certainty to employers that they can afford to keep those apprentices on the books and maintain that degree of training. The other part is a significant additional investment into skills and training. That's a partnership model with the states and territories. I can't off the top of my head, and I don't think I've got any notes here that tell me as to what the figure that is being discussed with the territory government is, but essentially we are looking for a co-investment model. We put in so much, the territory puts in so much to create a surge in additional training places over the next 12 months or so. So it is really focused around getting people through that sort of period of time that you're talking about, ensuring that the cost of training is not an impediment to access in that time, and guaranteeing then that yes, you can, just as we're looking to invest in those extra facilities at Uluru and Kakadu and upscale them, we want to make sure that we also, where we can, upskill the workforce for their return too. And do so in ways hopefully that recognise some of the changing dynamics of the market that we live in as well. I mean, the tourism industry has seen the change in the way people make decisions and make bookings, evolving over recent years in terms of shorter timelines for international travel, where people make those decisions, greater use of technology in terms of how they plan their trips and where they go and what they do, greater ability for operators to harvest data and think about these things. And obviously we need to upskill parts of the workforce in terms of how to take advantage of those things.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I think it's great that the funding is there, and I think one of the important things is here from a tourism perspective is that money filters down, because we don't have apprenticeships really in tourism. We have operators and guides and drivers, etc. That money is easy accessible to those guys as well to upskill as the businesses go on. So thanks for that reply. It's really great. We've been having a lot of discussion in Tourism Central Australia with our members around what is the face of tourism like moving forward, and how do we change what we've always done to kind of bring a new perspective and a new touring kind of strategy to what's happening moving forward. The biggest kind of thing we've come up with, or not the biggest, but the one that's on the front of everyone's mind is, and it's been talked about for 20 years as long as I've been in tourism, is the Morini Loop sealing, which is the Red Centre Way. We have sealed some of it, but we haven't sealed all of it. It would change the dynamic of tourism. I'm not sure if you're aware of how the structure of tourism works here. It's Ayers Rock, and then you have Alice Springs and Kings Canyons kind of in between. There's a whole loop missing there, which brings into context the West MacDonnell Ranges and the Hermannsburg area, which there's a lot of development in. That's probably the biggest thing alongside the art gallery, the National Aboriginal Art Gallery, that we would see as an industry that needs to happen. So that the support needs to come down from federal government to make this happen, so that on post-COVID, we have this new industry kind of piece that we can present to the world, like a kind of a Route 69 kind of section in the middle of Central Australia, or the Outback Way. It connects all that kind of series in these new adventure areas where people can utilize the best of Central Australia. So I suppose from the chair, that federal support needs to be there, and it will be advocated for quite strongly moving forward. So that's just giving you a heads up of what we're looking for. We need to reinvigorate tourism in Central Australia, and that's one of the key parts, I think, for self-drive, Indigenous tourism, tour operators. It really supports that whole area and allows growth in many areas for many businesses, to be honest.
Thanks, Patrick. I do appreciate very much the point that you're making there, and that pitch for that vision. And I'm obviously well aware of the long-term advocacy around the Outback Way and those and that broader vision, understanding how that then kind of hones into your particular region. So appreciate raising it.
Cool. Thanks for that, Glenn. I'll pass back to you, Glenn.
Thank you, Patrick. I would like to take the opportunity for Michael Scott, Chair of Tourism Top End, has a question, I think, for the Minister.
Yes, and firstly, thank you, Minister, for affording us the time on behalf of the Board of Tourism Top End, myself and Rachel. We really appreciate your time today. We know you're obviously a very busy person. We've got some real issues in the top end that surround what is essentially one of our icons, and that's Kakadu National Park. No doubt you're across some of the issues that have recently been recently surfaced between the traditional owners and the park's management. We're essentially sitting on the sidelines as respective spectators at the moment, but the national park and the access to the various iconic areas within the park is essentially, one of the prime movers for us up here. It was interesting that another $233 million was put forward to be spent, and I appreciate you confirming today 133 of that would be for Uluru and Kakadu. But that's over and above I think the 216 that Scott Morrison announced last year. We were hoping that while the lockdown was occurring, that some of these works would have got underway, but it appears not to be the case. When do you believe that we would start to see some effects of these monies that have been set forward, particularly for Kakadu?
Thanks very much, Michael. So I think the small works, and although it's $162 million for the two big parks there in the Territory,
right.
It's a composite of lots of smaller pieces, essentially, that are being brought forward as upgrades across the board. So our expectation is that those works should be able to get underway relatively quickly. Now, I haven't got a detailed briefing on that, and obviously what can be done in the different climate windows that allow it to differ across the two parks as well. But compared with the bigger master planning engagement of the mining sector as they leave, Kakadu and so on, which is a more complex piece to navigate, our view is that these should be simpler pieces of work to get on with and make sure they do happen relatively quickly. I'm aware of, without wanting to pretend that I'm across in detail, some of those issues around management issues that exist around Kakadu. I understand that my colleague Susan Lee, the Minister for the Environment, who's responsible for the national parks, will meet with the TOs in relation to management of Kakadu pretty soon. That she's spoken with the chair of the Kakadu Board of Management in recent times, and that we are trying to ensure that the long-standing joint management arrangements that exist between the government and TOs in managing those parks work effectively and don't impede us being able to get on and do the things that the tourism industry and the Territory generally need to see happen for the benefit of those parks. So I know that's not a terribly precise answer to address the concerns that you've raised, but it's we know it's a priority. Trying to get on with the resolution of it. I would say, as I said before, in terms of the additional infrastructure spending we announced, we're confident that they are actions that can proceed without a great deal of impediment being in the way. The bigger piece of the full rejuvenation of Jabiru and Kakadu as part of that departure of uranium mining, that is obviously a more complicated one that
Sure.
I've certainly driven the message home that from a tourism perspective, we want to see it all still happen as quickly as it can.
Thank you. Thank you.
Michael, do you have any other questions?
No,
for
that's
Minister?
fine.
Thank you, Michael. I might continue on, and thank you, Minister. And if I might just quickly throw to Simon Westaway. I know, Simon, you've been working hard from home there in Melbourne. It is now advocating for the needs of the Northern Territory, and we really appreciate the efforts you do through the Australian Tourism Industry Council. Just bring you in for a national perspective. You've been across what activities, conversations in this last week around Parks Australia's investment. Also keen to get your thoughts from a national perspective around what industry can be thinking about now with the opening of borders, especially here in the Northern Territory. Simon, you're on mute there, sorry, mate. There you go, mate, you're on.
Yeah, g'day, cheers. G'day, everyone. Hi from COVID capital Melbourne, another 300 today. So anyway, although we did intimate, the Premier, I should say, did intimate we weren't about to go on to DEFCON 4, so let's hope they don't go there. It'll be catastrophic, obviously. Thanks for the opportunity, Glenn, and thanks everyone, and Minister Birmingham, thanks so much. Look, it's great to have two ministers that are really across their briefs. We really appreciate it. Look, I'm not going to say a great deal. Thanks, Minister Birmingham, on your feedback and update around JobKeeper. Well, I can't let the opportunity obviously go by. ATIC, as you know, has been very strong, I think articulate and pretty constructive in our 5-point plan. In fact, I think you covered off on a couple of those today around obviously getting some advance notice of where we'll be going, which is great. And importantly, having a serious consideration around seasonality, which we think is really, really important. We think we've got a very simple approach. We've had good discussions with Treasury, your office, others around the need for looking around a business turnover perspective, absolutely needing to review the payment levels so that people aren't getting, in essence, taxpayers lifting up people's salaries or wage up until that $1,500 a fortnight level, having it back to where it should have been in the first place. But look, the maintenance of JobKeeper, we see it as a significant tourism policy, to be quite frank. We've just got to be able to get to the other side here. As I can share with you, the optimism in our industry is actually very strong. We've done a lot of surveys. Everyone's been surveyed to death and webinared to death in recent months. But the industry is actually more optimistic in many pockets of Australia than it's ever been if you look at it on a 2 to 3 year horizon. We just got to get through this next terrible phase. And so it's just really critical that we just, the government can partner with us. We're also obviously very hopeful that we'll get something out of next Thursday's announcement. Just other two quick things. Look, we'll continue. I wouldn't let the opportunity go by to bang on about the borders. All I'm just saying on that is, ATIC will fresh up our position on this in coming days, is we do see an opportunity through the National Cabinet process, which is very constructive, and we do get the constitutional issue around how we can have a more constructive approach to border management or articulation of border management as we come through the other side. I think what's been clear to us, and we've even seen, I think, 3 changes this week alone amongst a number of the states and territories, absolutely not questioning the right of a state and territory to maintain their own border, but we do, as One Australia, with no vaccine on the horizon, despite the copious press releases from various pharmaceutical companies. The reality is we've got to work and live with this thing, and our industry is COVID clean. Our COVID clean module within our quality tourism framework has been really inundated. Actually, we've got close to 2,000 receptors of it now, which is fantastic. So yeah, we've got to try and work and live with this virus. Look, thanks for the commitment around the parks, that funding through Parks Australia. Obviously, we're made aware of that announcement over Sunday, and that's fantastic and good to get some clarity around the physical numbers for both Uluru and Kakadu. We had some really good constructive discussions with Minister Lee's office this week, and we've got to try to find a pathway forward there and a role for tourism, and it's great to have that constructive dialogue, which we know it's a difficult situation. I think, look, just in final summary, look, we're optimistic for the future, to be honest, but we're in a really tough funk. This isn't an easy situation for our industry. It's not easy for any retail, basically any retailer. And what we need is a constructive One Australia approach. We need that constructiveness in the National Cabinet. We're very appreciative, Minister Birmingham, of you and the PM and others that are just trying to articulate that national message. the same time, we know at the territory and state level, we've got ministers behind our industry, such as Minister Moss. It's fantastic. I'm not trying to be sycophantic here. We know the ministers that they're trying to back our sector harder than perhaps some other elected officials who probably don't see the value in our industry as much as you guys do. So, yeah, look, thanks for coming on for like this, and yeah, we look forward to some constructive dialogue in the days ahead. Thanks, Glenn.
Terrific. Thank you, Simon. I will take the opportunity to just throw back to Patrick Bedford if you have any last questions or comments you'd like to raise on behalf of the folk in Central Australia. We're keeping an eye on the chat here as well.
I suppose it's the same thing as Kakadu. You know, the infrastructure at Uluru needs to be improved and brought to world-class standard, and it's something it was advised by James Finlay that they dropped the ball a little bit in the last meeting we had with them, so that needs to be reiterated. This is a world-class attraction that needs to be on a world-class pedestal to draw people back here when we get back to tourism. So that funding needs to be really put to good use in Central Australia and in Kakadu, obviously, as well as the other. What is tourism post-COVID? It's a big thing, and unfortunately that rests on your shoulders, Minister Birmingham and Minister Moss. So we're looking to you guys to lead this charge.
Thank you very much, and thank you. I might just have one last question, if I might, for Minister Birmingham. Mr. Birmingham, back in March, we announced a $1 billion tourism stimulus program. Unfortunately, by the end of that month, we were in border lockdown, and I think a lot of that holiday here this year and that activity was put on hold. What are your thoughts on at what point that reinvigorates? And do you see that part of it? I think from that we caught up and we lost a little bit of sight of that. Do you have any sort of updates you might be able to share around some funding for tourism on a national perspective through a stimulus program specific for tourism, either part of that $1 billion or continuing on?
Sure, Glenn. It sort of probably comes in a couple of parts there. So as you might remember, there were sort of a series of stimulus announcements that were made at the start of the year. There was an initial one that provided for some payments to businesses and those sorts of things. There was a second one that included a $1 billion support fund, and then there ended up being the big one that delivered JobKeeper and those sorts of supports. At the time the $1 billion was announced, JobKeeper wasn't on the radar. There was a lot of thought around, well, that's going to have to be the support to see tourism through this. Obviously, once JobKeeper was announced, the dynamics of that changed a little bit. So that $1 billion is being used as a support fund in a range of different ways to support ongoing regional aviation services and to keep connectivity of key centres and indeed key cities as well, in terms of maintaining a minimum domestic operation for airline activities. It's been used to deal with many of the fee waivers and fee reimbursements that we've made in relation to access to the national parks and those sorts of measures. In the tourism space, more specifically, essentially, what we have is funds that we've quarantined within Tourism Australia to enable a big step up and reactivation of the Holiday Here campaign when it's right to do so. And honestly, much like operators who are trying to look for some certainty around borders and knowledge there, the points that Simon made, frankly, in talking to Tourism Australia, I'm trying to grapple with the same question. When is a good time to step back into the market and start spending taxpayer dollars again in a way of really encouraging visitation to flow? And sort of, while it's only some states that are allowing free flow in different ways, or some states and territories, it doesn't really make sense for the national tourism body to step in. So in the sort of short term, while we are where we are right now, we're happily, you can go after Queensland tourists with comfort, or South Australian tourists with comfort, but that's about it really right now. It's probably more a job for Tourism NT in terms of the work that happens there to pursue. But once we see a breakthrough where most of the country is at least open to one another, then I really do want us to scale up that national marketing effort and that drive there. I think also once we've moved through decisions around JobKeeper and those things, that's also where we can start to then have a look at what the long-term rebuild and support around tourism looks like beyond just those marketing pieces that Tourism Australia will drive, but also any other types of incentives or activities that we can frame. So I assure you that there are millions of dollars quarantined within Tourism Australia to help ensure that we can step very strongly into the domestic market. We're also quarantining some in the hope that we can step strongly into the international market again at some stage, but the reality is that probably won't be much in this financial year. We haven't gone dark, as Philippa Harrison would say, in the international markets completely. We're not really spending any money, but we're maintaining quite an active social media profile. As some of you might have seen, sort of what's been billed really the Love from Australia campaign, that we just want to send out warm messages, nice images, reminders that build and maintain that enthusiasm in markets for people to think about coming here when they can again, so that we're not entirely starting from scratch.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So, I would probably just leave and just change gear for just one last question, if I might. You're our number one leader in the country for our tourism sector. It's not lost on us the pressure you must be under, given also that you are the Minister for Trade, and there's an enormous amount of activity going there, and also Minister for Investment. How are you going?
Thank you, Glenn. It's good of you to ask. Look, it hasn't been the year any of us planned. That's for sure. But I think, if I'm being really honest, much like the industry, something like JobKeeper was the circuit breaker for me. I've said publicly before that the last trip I made on the road of consultations with industry outside of my home state was in sort of a couple of weeks before JobKeeper, where I went through North Queensland and the Gold Coast and spoke to a lot of operators there. And I remember, coming back to Adelaide after those consultations, and that was some of the darkest days where I can recall dropping the kids off at school if I had the chance, and then driving to the office, listening to news from around the rest of the world of the catastrophe that was unfolding, and having the conversations of the tourism operators ringing in my ears, who could see their entire life's work slipping away from them, and really, what the hell do we do? In some ways, the step to broader lockdown measures that then necessitated JobKeeper and the huge sort of wave of financial support we've tried to deliver was a game changer. Because rather than trying to work out how do we just channel support in the tourism industry, we were able to make decisions on a whole of economy basis. And so for me, look, it's I'm very fortunate, I know, relative to the small business owners and the operators out there who are worrying about the ongoing viability of their businesses. So there's no shortage of stress on my shoulders, but I don't worry about where my salary comes from or whether I'm about to lose my business or lose my house. So it's all relative. Thank you for asking. The pressures are there, but in a sense, I see myself as a conduit for the pressures of industry, and that's my job at the cabinet table, to make sure that when we're sitting there, I've got the ammunition to basically say, this is what business are really feeling. This is genuinely what's happening on the ground. And if we don't do X or Y, these are the risks that we will face. And so that's the message that, that's why webinars and events like this are so important, just to keep getting refreshed with how people are seeing it and what the mood on the ground is.
Mr. Birmingham, thank you. Thank you for your time. The operators of the Northern Territory greatly appreciate that you've been able to put aside some time for us today. Thank you. I'd also like to thank, as always, Minister Lauren Moss. Thank you very much. Andrew Hopper, you've been sitting on the line there. Simon Westaway, thank you again for dialing in. Thank you to Patrick Bedford and to my chair, Michael Scott. G'day, Daniel, and g'day to all the members of Tourism Top End and Tourism Central Australia. Thank you, everyone. This has been a really meaningful time together, and there's been a great amount of sharing. So thank you. Stay safe, everyone, and we look forward to catching up again shortly. Thank you, Minister.